Okay, so get ready, because today we're diving into a question that has sparked debate for centuries, and that is, did Jesus ever actually claim to be God?
And the document you brought in takes a really unique approach. Instead of just looking at whether Jesus said the words, it asks, even if he didn't say it outright, could his actions, his words, could they be interpreted as a claim to divinity, especially back then?
Right. It's like we're trying to put together this giant puzzle,
Okay.
and the pieces are scattered throughout the Gospels, maybe even Revelation.
Mm.
And we're looking for those clues that point to a bigger picture, something we might be missing. So where do we even begin with something as complex as this?
Well, they actually start by going all the way back to the Old Testament, to that moment with Moses and the burning bush. You know, when God reveals his name as I am that I am.
Right. Exodus, it's such a powerful image.
Exactly. And it's more than just a name. It's about existence itself. When God says, I am, in Exodus 3:14 to 15, it signifies something eternal, without beginning or end. It's like he's saying to Moses, and to all of us, really, he's simply I-us.
Okay, that makes sense. God equals eternal existence. But how does Jesus fit into all of this?
Well, fast forward to John 8:58, where Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. You catch that? He uses that same phrase, I am, echoing God back to Moses.
Oh, wow, you're right. Now that you mentioned, there's a huge parallel. And I remember the document even points out that the people listening, they wanted to stone him
Mm-hmm.
for blasphemy. That's how strongly they reacted. It's like they instantly understood the weight of his words. So what does that tell us about how Jesus' audience understood what he was saying?
It shows us just how loaded those words were. Can you imagine someone today saying, I existed before Abraham? It would sound ludicrous, right? It's like saying you knew George Washington personally. For a Jewish audience, for Jesus to put himself on par with Abraham, someone so revered, someone who practically embodies their faith, is incredibly bold.
It makes you realize just how different things were back then. What we might read as a casual phrase today could have been earth-shattering then. But it doesn't stop there, does it? The document also dives into how Jesus' actions played a role in this whole debate.
Exactly. And one of the most striking examples is when Jesus forgives sins. This happens in Mark 2:5-11. Now, put yourself back then, okay? Imagine you're steeped in Jewish tradition. Who has the power to forgive sins?
Only God, right? It wasn't something a person could just do for someone else.
Exactly. And the document points out that even though the scribes listening, they don't say anything at first, they're accusing him of blasphemy in their heads just by his actions. Think about how radical that is to say you have the authority, the power to forgive sins, just like God.
It's like he's totally turning their understanding of God upside down. And then it happens again with the Sabbath, doesn't it?
Absolutely. In Matthew 12:8, Jesus calls himself the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, you might be thinking, okay, what's the big deal about the Sabbath? But to a Jewish audience, the Sabbath wasn't just another day. It was holy, set apart by God at creation. So by calling himself Lord over it,
He's basically saying he's on the same level as the one who created it.
yes, he's directly linking himself to the Ten Commandments. Remember how they start. Exodus 20:1-2, God himself says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Jesus isn't just bending the rules here, he's implying he made them.
Okay, so we've got Jesus saying, I am, he's forgiving sins, claiming authority over the Sabbath. It's like with every action, it adds another layer to this idea that maybe, just maybe, he's claiming something much bigger than anyone expected. But then the document takes us to a phrase that I find even more interesting, how often Jesus is called Son of God, and what that actually meant back then.
Yeah, it's easy to gloss over Son of God today, right? Like it's just a given. But to a Jewish audience in Jesus' time, that was anything but a simple statement.
So what are we missing then? How did they hear that phrase?
To them, Son of God wasn't some metaphor. It implied direct connection to God and a quality of being. Like, imagine trying to explain the Trinity back then, calling God your Father. It wasn't just a father-son relationship like we think of it. It was about sharing in God's very essence.
So not just being loved by God, but being God in some way.
Exactly. And here's what's fascinating. The document points out that even when people accuse Jesus of blasphemy for claiming this connection, he doesn't back down.
You're talking about John 10:30-33, right? Where he says, I and the Father are one, and people literally pick up stones to stone him. Talk about an intense reaction.
Right. That's exactly the point. If he just meant he was close to God, wouldn't that have been the moment to clear things up? Say, hold on, guys, you've got it all wrong. But instead, he lets them understand his words in the way they naturally would, a way that screams equality with God.
It's like he's almost inviting the controversy, isn't it? And the document even points out that this isn't just a one-time thing. Calling God my Father, like he does in John 5:17-18, just adds fuel to the fire.
It sure does, and again, their reaction is key. The Jewish leaders see it as a direct claim to be equal with God, and it nearly gets him killed. Makes you wonder, if he wasn't claiming to be divine, wouldn't he have been a little more careful with what he said, knowing how they'd take it?
It's like he's purposely blurring the lines between himself and God, right? There's even that moment in John 14.1 where Jesus links believing in him to believing in God. It's like they're inseparable.
It's almost as if he's saying, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. If you know me, you know God.
And then he takes it even further. In John 14.9, he straight up tells Philip, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. This isn't about being a messenger or a prophet anymore, right? This is something different.
Completely different. And the document drives that point home by showing how often Jesus embodies the characteristics that are usually reserved for God alone: wisdom, power, holiness. It's like he's reflecting those qualities as his own. He even goes as far as to say that any honor given to God should also be given to him. We see that in John 5.23.
Wow, that's incredibly bold. It's like he's challenging people to really think about what it all means. To look at him and not see a man, but something more. And speaking of seeing, the document brings up this really interesting contrast about how Jesus reacts to people worshiping him compared to how angels react.
Right. It's an important point. Think about it. If someone was worshiping you and they had the wrong idea, wouldn't you correct them? The document points out how angels, when people try to worship them, they absolutely refuse. We see it in Revelation 19.10 and 22.89. They understand they're not God. They know their place.
But Jesus, he just accepts it over and over again.
Multiple times. Matthew 2.11, 14.33, 15.25, 28.9, and even 28.1 seen. Luke 24.52, John 9.38. Every single time, he doesn't even hesitate. He allows them to worship him.
Which, to me, speaks volumes. It's like this unspoken claim that's just as powerful, if not more so, than just coming out and saying the words. But it's not just the worship, is it? There are those other titles he uses, too, ones that might not seem as obvious at first. Like when Jesus calls himself the Son of Man.
That's a great point, and the document really digs into that title too. I mean, it sounds kind of humble, especially compared to Son of God, but to a Jewish audience, an audience that knew their scriptures, it carried so much weight.
You're about to blow my mind again, aren't you?
Maybe just a little. It's not just about Jesus' humanity. It directly connects to Daniel 7.13:14. That's where Daniel sees a vision of one, like a son of man, coming on the clouds of heaven to receive authority and a kingdom from God.
Okay, so it's linking Jesus to this incredibly powerful figure, an eternal figure who has authority alongside God.
Yes. And what's even more interesting is that the document highlights how during his trial, when they ask him point blank who he is, Jesus uses this very title, Son of Man. He's referencing Daniel.
Wow, so at this pivotal moment, with all this pressure, he chooses a title that connects him to divine judgment.
Exactly. And not just any judgment, but judgment from heaven. Think about it. Clouds, heavens. Those were all associated with the divine. It's a subtle way of alluding to his true nature, but it's incredibly powerful.
It really is. It's like we're peeling back layers of an onion with all these titles and phrases, each one revealing a little bit more about how Jesus might have been claiming divinity, but without ever needing to directly say, I am God. It makes you think about how much we miss by just reading these stories without really considering the context.
You're exactly right. It's about understanding the nuances, the layers of meaning. And speaking of layers, the document actually points out one more really compelling piece of evidence. Something that links the Old and New Testaments in an amazing way.
Okay, I have to know. What is it?
Well, in Revelation 1.17, Jesus refers to himself as the first and the last. Now, does that sound familiar?
Wait a minute. That's how God is described in Isaiah.
You got it. Isaiah uses that exact phrase, the first and the last, to describe God. Isaiah 41.4, 44.6, and again in 48.12. It's how he emphasizes God's eternal nature.
So Jesus is claiming language that was used for Yahweh himself, the God of Israel. That's huge.
It is huge. And as if that wasn't enough, in Revelation 22.2213, he adopts the titles Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. And guess what? These were used earlier in Revelation, but only for God the Father.
It's like he's saying, remember all those names and titles you used for God? Well, they apply to me too.
Exactly. And the timing of this is really interesting. It happens right when Revelation shows God and the Lamb sharing a throne. In Revelation 22.1 and verse 3, it suggests a shared dominion, a co-rulership over everything.
It definitely paints a different picture than just saying Jesus never claimed to be God, doesn't it?
It really does. It opens up so many questions and possibilities.
It's amazing when you really start to break it all down, like the I am statements, Jesus forgiving sins like it was nothing, calling himself Lord of the Sabbath, not to mention those titles, Son of God, Son of Man, they take on a whole new meaning when you think about how they would have been heard back then, don't they?
Absolutely. And we can't forget about the worship. The fact that Jesus accepts it when angels refuse it, or how he uses language taken straight from the Old Testament, language that describes God. It really makes you reconsider things.
It does. I mean, one of the biggest takeaways for me is just how important context is. It's so easy to read these stories through our modern lens, but when you actually try to put yourself back in that time,
Huh.
when you imagine hearing those words spoken out loud with all those layers of meaning,
It completely changes your perspective, doesn't it?
it really does. Like, we can't underestimate how much the people listening to Jesus, they knew their Jewish tradition. They knew their scriptures. So if we're picking up on these connections, imagine how powerful they would have been to them.
I doubt they would have just brushed his words aside as metaphorical or symbolic.
Exactly. This is what I love about this document.
Okay.
It doesn't give us a simple answer. It lays out the evidence, all these different pieces of the puzzle, and it invites us to wrestle with it, to come to our own conclusions.
Exactly. It's about engaging with the material, thinking critically about it, and coming to your own understanding.
And that's what makes these ancient texts so fascinating. They're not just stories from the past. They're alive with ideas that continue to impact us today.
I completely agree.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the biggest question this document leaves us with is, if we really try to step back in time to understand how Jesus' audience would have understood him with all their cultural background, does it change our perception of him? Does it challenge what we believe about who Jesus is?
Now, those are questions worth pondering.
They are. And on that note, we'll leave you to do just that. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and keep asking the big questions.